Hey everyone, it's Sevy. I waited a bit to make this Albedo guide because he's getting several buffs this version 2.3. The Cinnabar Spindle, the Husk of Opulent Dreams set, and Goru. Those three buffs are now available for us players to experience, so I think it's about time for an updated Albedo guide. In this guide, I'll go over Albedo's kit, constellations, best artifacts and weapons for low and high ARs, and best team comps. Let's begin! The heart of Albedo's kit lies in his elemental skill and defense damage scaling. His skill is a flower that he can place as a geo construct. This flower creates a large field which can proc AoE geo damage every 2 seconds when an enemy within the field takes damage from another source. These are referred to as transient blossoms. This talent's damage scales purely from defense. As such, he is one of the few characters you can totally dump your defense artifacts on. Take note that the blossom's damage won't proc without the enemy taking damage, especially if the enemy is shielded. Albedo's first passive then increases the damage that these blossoms deal to enemies at half HP. When you tap Albedo's skill, he places the flower right in front of him, but if you hold Albedo's skill, you can aim where to place it. It's important to be aware of the flower's positioning because as a geoconstruct, it's prone to breaking from enemy damage or not placing at all if too near a large enemy. The skill cooldown of both the tap and the hold is 4 seconds, but the duration of the field is a whole 30 seconds. This means you can pretty much get 100% uptime on his flower field. Since his skill applies geo damage upon proccing, it will crystallize when it hits something that has another applied element. Picking up the crystal gives you an elemental shield. This is another support function of Albedo, generating constant shields on the battlefield. While not as strong as talent-based shields, they can at least offer a bit of added protection. You also don't need to worry too much about Albedo messing up your reactions whenever the skill does geo damage. Its elemental gauge is weak, and to simplify, that means it won't get rid of elemental auras on enemies that fast, so you can still proc your vapes and melts quite reliably. Albedo's elemental skill is also his famous Albedo Vator. If you stand on it for a moment, it will lift you up. This mechanic can be utilized to dodge enemies or avoid them altogether or initiate plunge attacks. In exploration, it can help you climb stuff. However, it's harder to take advantage of it in the heat of battle, and it can lift you even when you don't want it to. The second key part of Albedo's kit is his burst, which costs only 40 energy. The most important thing to note is that while Albedo's skill scales purely from defense, his burst scales purely from attack at C0. This does mean that you have to choose which talent to prioritize since they don't scale on the same stat. Albedo's burst deals geo AoE damage when initially cast. If his burst is cast within his field generated by his skill, it will generate an additional 7 fatal blossoms. These blossoms will track enemies within the field and explode at them for further AoE damage. So for example, if there are 7 enemies within the field, then each blossom will target 1 enemy. If there are less than 7 enemies, then the leftover blossoms will target randomly. Clearly, you want to cast his burst only if his flower is active and you're inside it to maximize his damage. Since these blossoms explode in AoE and can stack damage on top of each other, Albedo's burst has quadratic scaling, like Child's Riptide and Ganyu's burst. So if you want to get the most of his blossom's AoE and targeting, you can use crowd control to group your enemies into his skill field. Additionally, Albedo's second passive talent gives his team members 125 EM per 10 seconds when casting his burst. This allows him to be helpful in team comps that rely on reaction damage. It's a very simple, easy-to-use kit that does its main job, which is providing constant off-field damage on top of his other support utilities. For his talent priority, you can practically leave his auto attacks alone and just focus your resources on leveling up his skill and burst. Once you hit level 6 on both, the skill talent should be your first priority. Now let's look at his constellations. C1 just helps Albedo get back a bit more energy. This is a meh constellation for me, as I've never found Albedo to have energy problems if you pair him with another geo unit. While it does improve his burst spam ability, you should only get this if you're aiming for C2 at least. I would say that C2 is his best constellation to add more burst DPS and quick swap utility. It makes his burst damage scale off his defense stat too, which practically solves split scaling issues and allows you to build full defense on him, knowing that his burst damage will benefit from it. And with his new 4-star weapon, C2 is even more valuable now. If you're an Albedo simp, C2 is the best constellation to target and stop at. But to emphasize, C2 isn't necessary to do good damage with Albedo since his skill is still his primary source of damage. C3 just increases his skill damage. C4 is only a useful constellation with Xiao since it increases plunging damage by 30%. It's a strange buff and I think it was meant to add more incentive to use his elevator. Although the act of doing this might feel too clunky and the payoff wouldn't be worth it for most characters. Not really worth aiming for unless you're a dedicated Xiao main. C5 just increases his burst damage. C6 is a fairly simple constellation too, as it adds 17% damage bonus to anyone in Albedo's skill field that's protected by a crystallized shield. For a final constellation, it's a bit underwhelming to be honest. It requires 2 layers of conditions and it only increases the active character's damage, not the entire team's. Now let's go to his artifact stats and set priorities. For Albedo's main stats, you want to aim for a defense % sans, geo damage goblet, and crit for the circlet for at least a 50 to 100% crit ratio. There are 2 alternative scenarios for his artifact main stats though. You can put a defense circlet instead if you run him on a Harbinger of Dawn since the weapon will satisfy your crit needs already. Then there's a case for putting an attack % sans on him to offer more to his burst, since the new artifact set and weapon already give so much defense, especially if your Albedo isn't C2. However, I would recommend this only if it's an attack % sans with good substats and if you need to fulfill a set bonus. Otherwise, you can just go for the standard defense sans. For early AR players, 2-piece Defender's Will is pretty obvious since it gives him plus 30% defense. It can stay on him until you get a better husk set replacement. 2-piece Gambler also fits him as it increases skill damage by 20%, which is where Albedo gets most of his damage from. 2-piece and 4-piece Exile work great to make him a better support, so you can also regenerate your team's energy by using his burst. And since his burst cost is only 40, it's easier to spam the 4-piece effect, or you can opt for a 2-piece collar alternative as well for the ER. You can also give him a Berserker set for the crit rate. Now for late AR sets, if you can't commit to 4-piece sets yet, you can settle on a combination of these in the meantime. 2-piece Archaic for geo damage in both his skill and burst, 2-piece Noblesse for burst damage, and 2-piece Husk for more defense and higher skill damage. The top endgame target is now the Husk of Opulent Dreams set, a direct buff for Albedo. It's basically his best in slot set for damage and he can easily trigger its 4-piece effect. Even if you already have a well-built Albedo on the previous combinations mentioned, this will still be a significant damage bump that is well worth farming for in the long run. Additionally, the nice thing about Albedo is that he can use support artifact sets as well. 4-piece Noblesse is a viable build for a more support-oriented Albedo because, especially when he's paired with another Geo character, he can get his burst up quite easily. Albedo's burst cooldown is only 12 seconds, which is the exact duration of the Noblesse buff too. 4-piece Tenacity is another support option. Although Albedo doesn't benefit much from the 2-piece bonus, his skill can hit frequently enough to get great uptime on the 4-piece bonus, giving your team more attack and shield strength. Take note that 4-piece Archaic Petra is not an optimal support set because to get the buff, it has to be Albedo himself who will pick up the crystal, not another member of your party. Switching to Albedo in the middle of your rotation just to pick up a crystal will make your rotation clunky. Now for the best weapons. Thankfully, Albedo's top choices are extremely free-to-play friendly. His top choice used to be the Harbinger of Dawn, which is an easily refinable 3-star weapon that will almost fulfill your crit needs, so you can just focus more on stacking defense on him. It works well since Albedo's skill doesn't scale on attack, so the low base attack of the weapon is irrelevant. And since Albedo functions more as a quick swap unit, you can easily keep his health near or at full, so the additional crit bonus will always be in effect. The only downsides are 1. If there is a corrosion mechanic present that could ruin the passive effect. 2. The low base attack will make his burst damage noticeably lower if he's on C0. Now with the Cinnabar Spindle, which only Albedo can use properly, this is the weapon that pretty much supercharges his skill damage. Even better if Albedo's on C2. The only downside versus the Harbinger of Dawn is that you need to get luckier with crit rolls on your artifacts, but I think it's a trade worth making. After giving this to my Albedo, who's used a Harbinger of Dawn ever since, and with good crit stats, I don't see myself going back anymore. For other options, the original event weapon was the Festering Desire, which synergizes with him by increasing skill damage and skill crit rate. However, I do think other characters could make better use of that ER substat. There's also the Summit Shaper, which was supposedly his signature weapon. It does address his split scaling a bit at C0 to give his burst more oomph, but really its value is overshadowed by his more accessible weapons. You could put a Jade Cutter on him, which will spoil him quite a bit and essentially fix his crit rate, but again, his free weapons are just there, and just give the Jade Cutter to someone else. So in terms of weapons, you pretty much have your best choices handed to you on a free-to-play platter. Now let's look at Albedo's best teams and teammates. When it comes to capitalizing on Albedo's geo damage, his best teammate pre-2.3 was Zhongli. Their combined geo resonance and Zhongli's Jade Shield resistance shred was one of the most efficient ways of boosting Albedo's damage. That pair has so far been excellent for supporting other DPSs as well. Albedo also pairs nicely as a support for Ningguang and Noelle. With Ningguang, Albedo can make use of her Geo buffing Jade screen and give Geo resonance. With Noelle, Albedo also acts as a great battery to charge up her burst. But now, with version 2.3, it looks like Albedo's best support is Goru. Goru buffs both defense and geo damage when there are at least 3 geo members in the party. This essentially motivates us to put more geo defense scaling characters in the team, whether that's Noelle or Ito, who scales additionally on defense. Although Albedo is not meta in non-geo partnerships or team comps, he can easily fit any of your flex spots as a support or extra off-field damage or buffing with the Noblesse or Tenacity set. His weak elemental gauge and extra EM buffing makes him viable for reaction comps like Hu Tao Xingqiu or Child Xiangling. If you have a DPS that uses 4-piece bolide, putting Albedo on the team will increase your shield uptime thanks to the crystallized shields. Albedo also benefits from characters that give long durations of off-field damage, like Oz, Xiangling's Burst, Ganyu's Burst, Venti's or Kazuha's Burst, since these help Albedo's skill Blossom's proc. Venti in particular is great to crowd control enemies for his burst. Overall, Albedo's just a solid character to fit in your free flex slot. So everyone, that's pretty much it for this updated Albedo guide. I would love to know in the comments if you have Albedo and how you'll be building him. But if this video helped you out, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I will see you soon. Take care!